I've always been fascinated by horror games. From a young age, I was far too scared to play even the babiest of horror games like Luigi's Mansion or even that old Scooby Doo Gamecube game, but my exposure to the likes of FNAF, Resident Evil 7, and many others through the Let's Plays I watched as a kid got me interested in the genre. Although, if I'm being honest, the horror games that got me most intrigued weren't always the mainstream content. One day I happened upon a certain horror game that to this day sticks out among the crowd, to me at least. This game was Into the Gloom. Incidentally, I don't remember when I came across it or even bought it because about 3 years ago I stumbled across it in my library, having only vague memories of playing it prior. A few of you may remember that's when I made my original video on the game, but I've never been completely satisfied with it. There were a lot of questions that went unanswered about this game that truly did captivate me, and with so much left for me to discover, I think there's no better time than the present to finally revisit Into the Gloom and conclude this story that's been sitting in the back of my mind for so long now. After stumbling through a void of darkness filled only by the strange sounds of ghostly creatures to find his way to the path of light, our protagonist Ethan wakes up in an eerie, empty hospital. Equipped only with his wits, Ethan's gotta explore this hospital to figure out where he is and why he's here. Before I get into the meat of the game, I first want to talk about the game's visuals since that's what immediately sticks out. Aesthetically, Into the Gloom takes a lot of inspiration from many of its peers from the time like I See You, 7 Days, and of course, I'm Scared. This was something I neglected to mention in my original video, and I'll be honest, it is super blatant, but I've seen plenty of games get criticized for copying the art style of other games, and it never feels fair. I can't say I get the sentiment behind this argument because no one game owns any visual style it takes under. Does that make Into the Gloom's use of this retro-inspired blocky 3D style any better? Not particularly, but something you have to remember is that this game was an indie project developed by a small team mainly consisting of 3 brothers and a few other contributors. It's likely that they saw many of the popular indie horror tropes at the time and were inspired to create something of their own with those other games as a visual reference. Of course, given this is a paid product, it should be held up to a certain standard, and I do think there's something to be said about taking an art style and trying to do something new with it so that it sticks out more. And while the art style can work well for creating a surreal, nostalgic, yet uneasy environment, Into the Gloom's visuals, for the most part, don't do anything that hasn't been seen before. Dark, dimly lit environments with a bland color palette, boring set pieces, and uninteresting areas like the sewer, the hospital, or even the brief detour through the prison don't give off a strong impression of the game's horror appeal. Fortunately, I feel like the game's sound design makes up for this a bit. I will admit though, the game's atmosphere works a lot better if you haven't already played or seen much of any other horror games, because Into the Gloom makes use of another trope in the horror game medium that I loathe. Jump scares are some of the weakest, cheapest methods used to startle a player rather than actually scare them in a meaningful way. That's not to say that there hasn't been any good applications of sudden scares, but I'm more specifically referring to jump scares that happen out of nowhere, completely unexpected and unpredicted by the player, which is something that Into the Gloom likes to do somewhat frequently. In certain areas, you'll be walking around just as usual when suddenly, jump scare. Midway through the game, they love throwing 2 jump scares at you in a row, and I'll admit they got me every time, but never in a good way. The only way a jump scare works for me is for the fear of the scare itself to be built up in a meaningful way. To give the most basic example, let's say you're heading into a new area, and as you're about to enter, you stumble across a note saying that something is here with you, or better yet, you hear something indicating that someone else is nearby. There are far more and better ways to execute this, but trying anything is better than a cheap jump scare, to be honest. The game sort of succeeds at this with the chase sequences. At certain points of the game, a creature known only as the Shadow will give chase and make a noise that genuinely made my stomach curdle. It might sound corny, but these chase sequences, as simple as they were, freaked me out and were pretty good as a result. Throughout the game, they slowly expand on the chases, throwing new terrain for you to navigate and even a brief puzzle or two you'll have to solve. But how does the rest of the gameplay fare? Into the Gloom is a linear game separated by a bunch of equally linear levels with just a dash of exploration required to find the items you'll need to unlock further areas for progression. Some items you can use as is, but others will have to be combined to be of any help. This is mostly a weak attempt at giving certain puzzles the illusion of having depth though. I don't even think it's fair to call a lot of these puzzles, since all you have to do is find the item you'll need, then the place to use it, like the pipe to grab the maintenance key or the pliers to cut the wire on the door. Though at least with the pliers you have to solve a dial puzzle to earn them. The actual puzzles are all pretty pretty basic, requiring just enough thought to at least be satisfying to solve. Though I can't lie and say I didn't wish these puzzles got a little bit more complex over time, since there isn't much to the gameplay other than exploring these super basic areas. I feel like some better set pieces and area design, making for an overall better atmosphere, could have made up for the gameplay being somewhat lacking, but oh well. With all of the gripes and criticisms I've thrown at the game so far, you're probably left wondering why I even like this game. Well, that's where we get into the story. A good story can sometimes carry the experience of an otherwise mediocre game, and fortunately I like this one quite a bit. At the beginning of the game, we learned that due to Ethan suffering from a brain tumor, he had to undergo surgery, which led to an unfortunate issue in the operating room that put him into a coma. What does this have to do with Ethan's current state of being? Well, as you explore more and more of this strange place, you'll soon figure out that this is a realm known as the Gloom. The Gloom is a dimension that many lost souls stumble into after ending up in the nowhere. As for how you end up in the nowhere, I don't remember if that's explained. The game only specifically mentions two people who've entered after falling into a comatose state, Ethan and the Shadow. Over time, most of the lost souls found that the way to escape the Gloom and return to the real world was through suicide, which explains the countless hanging bodies you find throughout the game and the nice notes on the walls telling you to kill yourself, though one individual who tried this failed to escape. That individual was the Shadow. Originally known as Mark Harrison, he was a convicted serial killer sentenced to death by lethal injection, except something didn't go right. Instead of dying outright, he fell into a coma, which, ignoring how unrealistic that may or may not be, brought him into the Gloom. His body was dismembered by the authorities to hide the truth of the botched execution, removing his only link to the real world, rendering him unable to die and trapping him in the Gloom forever. Over the years of exposure to the Gloom, and after many failed suicide attempts, his soul began to corrupt his appearance and his sanity, transforming him into a strange being driven by his thirst for revenge. Getting caught by the Shadow shows that many unfortunate souls were captured by him before you even arrived at the Gloom, doomed to be tortured by him for all eternity. Or are they? Apparently, over time, the Gloom can corrupt people so much that they eventually become the ghostly figures that jump scare you, which is the final stage of corruption before disappearing from existence. Though I am a little confused on why the Shadow isn't affected by this. Maybe it is just because his real body died, but if you free the knife dude in the prison yard much earlier on in the game, we learned that he discovered the Gloom centuries ago and has come in and out of it several times to essentially cheat death by stealing other people's bodies and living much longer than he would have normally. And that's another thing, what method does the knife dude use to steal other people's bodies? This is never explained and is only made more confusing by the game's true ending, which you can only achieve by freeing the knife dude. Normally, the game would end after the final chase sequence with the Shadow, where you have to look out for the numbers on the walls to input this keypad to open a door, leading you to a noose which lets you finally escape the Gloom. Except you're missing all of your memories, again another thing that isn't explained, like why does the knife dude have his memories then? I guess this guy just knows everything and is all powerful, whatever. Anyway, if you free the knife dude, the chase sequence will instead end with you failing to escape because the knife dude actually stole your body, which is like a really creepy concept. I honestly wish the game would use more of the story to their advantage in the actual game because you get a good 3/4 of the story and character explanations in the main menu's notes section. I don't know, I thought it would have been super cool if we learned in the actual game after freeing him that the knife dude knows how to escape by stealing other people's bodies, and maybe having him be the secondary antagonist, working alongside the Shadow to capture you so they can escape, leading to the Shadow inevitably betraying Knife Dude in a final showdown and giving you a brief window to finally escape the Gloom. Instead, we never see the Shadow or Knife Dude again. There's a brief section where you're heading through the Shadow's torture camp where he holds all of the lost souls, and this could have been a perfect finale, but no, we literally just walk through it. I guess Ethan doesn't care enough to save anyone, but okay, that's a disappointing missed opportunity. Instead, we end up at the house of Dr. Warren, a researcher living in the Gloom who's created a machine that can bring you back to the real world if suicide failed. Unfortunately, he got lost in another subplane of the nowhere, the Red Plane. Using his machine, we have to find him, bring him back to his lab, and finally, for real this time, escape the Gloom. By this point, I was getting really tired of Into the Gloom. The only enjoyable segment here is the Iron Maze, but everything else was pretty boring and I didn't care about Dr. Warren as a character. If anything, I feel like his inclusion conclusion cheapens the story a bit. Like, how did this guy figure out how to not only make a machine that can bring him back to life, but also travel between planes in the nowhere? Oh, don't worry about it. He's just really smart and studied mechanics and energetic phenomena. Buzzword, buzzword, buzzword. I don't know, but after a bad climax puzzle, we return to Dr. Warren's lab, leaving his assistant behind who died earlier, rip bozo, and now we finally get to head home. The only caveat is Ethan is brought back into someone else's body, since the knife dude is now occupying his. Conveniently though, Dr. Warren also knows how to send Ethan into the body of someone in the area he lives in. Like, okay, sure, that totally makes sense. So now Ethan is back in the real world as some homeless guy with the plan of taking back his body from the knife dude. Happy ending, I guess, even though I don't know how Ethan is planning on getting his body back. Like, what's he gonna do, kill his body? Nevertheless, the story of Into the Gloom is far and beyond the most interesting and my favorite aspect of the game. I wish Dr. Warren wasn't introduced as a convenient solution to Ethan's escape. It just feels really cheap, honestly. I also wish they took further advantage of most of the story elements, because it really felt like they were building up the Shadow a lot in the notes as the main antagonist, yet we don't even get to explore his home. Honestly, conceptually it's still really cool to me. I love the Shadow as a villain, even if he didn't get a proper conclusion, and I think the Gloom itself is something that could be explored further for a sequel of some sort if the developer was ever interested. Though maybe some things are better left alone, as I feel like Into the Gloom works best in a vacuum. In truth, as much as I may love the game, due to a weak atmosphere, bog standard horror walking sim gameplay, and story oversights, I don't think this would appeal to many people. However, I still think it's worth playing at least once, and it's really cheap, having a $3 price tag, which makes it hard to have a lot of the issues I've discussed ruin the game for me personally. I don't usually play a lot of horror games, but I feel like more often than not, weird or obscure ones like this appeal to me the most. There's a few I'd love to cover on the channel at some point, so let me know if any of that would interest you. For now, I've been Wyrlwind, and I'll see you in the next one.